Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jan, and yeah, I thought right. So web components are the new, like a new thing in browsers, right? And I thought it would be quite nice now that browser support is basically finally there with just Edge to go, to have a look at web components and how to use them in React. And I thought we could just basically build a component here together and have a look at how this works in React. Before we start, a quick summary: what are web components? So that's a browser spec consisting of 3 parts. We have the custom elements, which is probably the most important thing. It's basically the component model for the web. Right, you can write your own elements that the browser understands and add logic to it. And then you have the shadow DOM, which allows you to encapsulate styles and make sure they don't bleed out of your elements. So like previously, you could add a CSS class and call it button, but then it would be available all over the page, and everything that is a button is styled like this. If you put this class inside of a component with a shadow DOM, then it's only there inside of this thing, and every other part of the app, of the web page, is not affected by this. And then you have the template element, which is just an HTML element, and you could put more HTML inside, and the browser will parse this, but not render it anywhere. So you can just reuse this across your page kind of efficiently. For React, we don't really care about the template element. Like to integrate into React, the most important thing is probably the custom element. Yeah, before we start, React has its own component model, so why would we use custom elements and web components? I think the most important thing is probably we just find a component out there and want to use it. That doesn't really exist a lot now. There are a couple of things, like GitHub uses some custom elements and publish them. So for example, this details dialog, if you want to use an accessible dialog element, you might want to use this. But since this is new, I expect more of these to come out later or in the future. And then this may actually be a viable option. And then if you find an element that works perfectly for you, why not use it? Yeah, the second point for me is you might not only have a React app. It's probably quite uncommon to have a React app and an Angular one and a Vue one and whatever else. But you might have a WordPress blog, which is just a simple website, and you want to use some things there as well. And web components that you can reuse without adding a whole library might be quite nice. Yeah. So before we start to go to the to build a web component, while I was researching for this talk, I saw a bit of polarizing opinions on the internet, and I thought it could be quite nice to show them here. So we had these people on the React side saying, well, web components are really hard to work with, and React can do all the things anyway, and web components can't do anything, can't do all the things that React do, so don't use web components. And then on the other side, we have the web components team, and it's well, that's a standard now. React is such a huge library. You can't really use it without tooling like Babel, don't use React. And there's some truth to all of this, but it's probably not, it doesn't, it's not that black and white. And in fact, the React documentation even says that React and web components are built to solve different problems, and web components provide encapsulation for reusable components, while React is a declarative library that keeps the DOM in sync with your data. And really, you can use both. You can use React in web components, and you use web components in React. And then you can actually see this documentation. It shows an example of how to use React in web components, but not the other way around. So I thought it could be quite nice to try this now. Yeah, so first we need a web component. So let's build this nice greeting element. Yeah, it has a salutation. It shows very nice and super smart people, and it has this little hand that you can click. And I mean, the markup is really simple. We just have some styles. We can actually use IDs here, and it's pretty safe because it's in the Shadow DOM, so our IDs are like in this place only. The slot is a specific thing I want to point out, because that's the part where our children are rendered. Like, imagine this basically being props.children in React. So we have this thing. Now we can build our custom element. So we create a class. We have to use a class, really. And we extend HTML element. And then it's just the standard stuff. We have a constructor, can set a few defaults. We attach a shadow, which creates the shadow DOM, and we just put our template inside. We can bind an event, and well, that's the next thing we can do. Just fire events. That's how we would fire events and notify things outside of our component. And well, we have like a render method which updates our children when something changes. And then we continue with adding a few properties so that people outside can change data. And yeah, that's pretty simple. Properties. And then salutation is just a string, so it's quite common on the web to have attributes. So just listen on on the salutation attribute. Now we can use set attribute, or we can just use this in the HTML to change this part. And last, we tell the browser that this exists, and we bind it to the my greeting element name. And then, right, I'm going to try to show this. Not sure how big this is, probably better to do this here. So, like, all the code of this thing is here. I just added a few more styles to make this hand look nicer. I'm just going to paste this in the console. This is actually just about blank, but this should work just fine. So our element is defined, and then if we just edit this here, and so I don't have to type too much stuff. I prepared an example. Can you see this? So we have an attribute here, salutation, and we have the content like a children, people, and we just paste this in here, and that should be enough to make Chrome render our element. And well, that already works. Like, you can already click this. So then let's interact with it. I gave it the ID greeting, so now I can set something on it. Set some data, and it should update, and that works. And lastly, you can just use the normal event binding and add an event handler and show an alert. Is that big enough? Scroll this more. Oh, shit. Right. So now we have an event, so when I click it, it should. Well, it's a very tiny alert, but it's there. Right. Yeah, so that's the web component. Quite simple, but it should have all the features that a web component has. So let's try to use this in React. And let's first summarize. So we have children, which was the people string, and then we have attributes, which was the salutation, properties, which was everything else, or like salutation and our traits, and properties can also be then objects and functions and whatever we want to assign. And then we have events. And in React, we can use children. React will just render them fine. We can use attributes. Whenever React sees a custom element in JSX, it will call set attribute and everything you put there. Unfortunately, this means that properties don't work just like this. And the same thing is for events, because React has this synthetic event system that just works with like known DOM events, and our events are not known to it, so it doesn't pick them up. But we can make this work. Let's start with children and attributes. This will just work. Salutation is an attribute, props to children can be rendered. That will work. Properties, for these we have to use refs. This uses the new hooks API. Use ref is like create ref in the model before hooks. And then we can use an effect, which is basically component did update or component did mount, and update the, whatever properties we have. The catch here is that if our custom element is, if the JavaScript of our element is loaded later, which might be desirable, then we may need to wait until our element is defined for it to pick up this, this property change. And that's what we can do with custom elements that were defined. The same thing works for events. We can use an effect and we can just add an event listener. I used layout effect here. The reason is that this runs directly after render. You can use you can use effect as well. I guess that you have to test if that looks weird if something happens slightly after the render. Right, and we can have a look at this as well. Oh, okay. So that is basically our whole greeting element bound to React. It's quite a bit, but we can abstract all of this away and create a wrapper for custom elements, which could work similar to something like this, where we would just define whatever the custom element has, like which props, and bind them automatically. And then I just put this in a create React app, basically like here, and assigned props to it. And that should work. Yeah, so that's the custom element running. I can click this, I just bound this to a counter, which is updated in React. And if we look at the React DOM, then we can see the element in there as well. So this one is the wrapper. Oh my God. This one is the wrapper, and inside we have our web component. And when we edit stuff in the wrapper, it would also propagate there. Well, yeah. All right. So really, all of these things, can work. And there are elements out there, like the first one that the one example that I gave about the GitHub's details dialog element that doesn't actually use properties. That has one event, which is optional. So if you don't need to use this, you don't even need a wrapper. You can literally just put this in your app and it will work. And in the future, that might be even easier. There is an RFC out for React for better custom element support, which proposes to use to set properties by default instead of attributes, which would make one of the effects not needed anymore. And the next project is React Fiber. Which is like a modernization of the React DOM. And there is discussion about removing the synthetic event system, which would essentially then also make DOM events work by default. Yeah, and that's it really. If you want to read more about this, the all the example code is here on GitHub, and the interestingly, just last Friday, an article series finished on CSS tricks, which finished with advanced tooling for web components that had an example of how to use them in React, which pretty much came to the same conclusion, but it's also a very, very good read. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Jan. Do you have any questions about web components for Jan?
Any question should I make? No, jokes apart. What is your idea for the future web components? Because I read a lot of very discording ideas as well. So there are people that tell, oh, you should learn them by the end of the year, we will replace Angular, we will replace React. Other people say the opposite. So I done some investigation myself, I done some investigation. What is your conclusion about that?
Yeah, I don't think that any framework will go away soon. Like React can do so much more, right? Like the new feature with suspend and time slicing, and just the declarative way of, declaring your UI is so useful that you can't do with just web components. I think they will not go away. But especially for simple sites, I mean, like GitHub uses web components. I think that they are really useful.
I can go on if no, I was also interested in terms of performances, because performance still depends a lot on what kind of use you make for web components. Right now, React can win if you're using the virtual DOM correctly, so you do a lot of replacement and so on. Stencil, if you play with it, does something, but it's not as smart as efficient. So if React manages to implement web components and keeping all the good parts of the optimization of it, I think that would make it even more of a winner in the long run. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. Like if there is a smaller library that does what React does, but removing a bit of stuff because you can use web components under the hood, that sounds really good.
Any more? Right at the back. Oh, sorry. It's not your fault.
So I'm probably just a bit ignorant. What does GitHub use this particular web component for? Why might I choose to use web component?
I mean, I guess GitHub uses this because they because they want to support like every single browser and every single use case. So I guess ideally GitHub works without JavaScript or with like the very bare minimum. And apparently they decided that web components are a good fit for them. So for example, every dialog that they open apparently uses this dialog element. If you see any time, like 30 minutes ago, that is a web component. They don't use Shadow DOM, interestingly, probably because Shadow DOM, you can't server-side render this, which is a bit unfortunate. I guess it just helps if you need to deliver less JavaScript because there's no library need for it. And yeah.